Hey guys, welcome to Supposedly Fun. I'm Greg. Today, I thought it would be fun to talk about books that have made me cry. I've mentioned recently that there are not actually a whole lot of books that have made me cry, but I feel like I've talked about them a fair amount on here, so I got curious and I went to my Goodreads page where I have a folder for books that made me cry, and there are only 11 books in there. So I thought I would talk about them. The first one I want to talk about is the book that probably gave me the first really big cry, and definitely the ugliest. It is Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. I read this in a 5th grade class, and we were supposed to be reading it in class, but I snuck it home and read it there, and thank goodness I did, because I had a total breakdown, like snot was running down my face, I was kind of gasping for breath, and I read the ending in some discount shoe store with my mother, and she had to rush us out of there. It was just bad. This was a very good book, though. It's about Billy, who saves to buy himself 2 hunting dogs, Old Dan and Little Ann, and they form this really tight-knit group. But of course, there are dangers that lurk in the woods, and it's a good book, but if you want to read it, you better brace yourself. The book that probably gave me the second biggest ugly cry is actually a play. It's called Wit by Margaret Edson, and it is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I saw this performed when I was in my late teens, and Judith Light actually was the actress in it. And I enjoyed it, but it didn't impact me all that much. I guess I was probably too young to really engage with the material. So it actually had its big effect on me years later. When I was in my mid-20s, I went into a Barnes & Noble and I saw this on the shelf, and I remembered liking it. So I picked it up and I brought it home. And I think because I was a little older, I was actually able to grapple with its messages and its themes. But also, I had a much more personal connection to it. So this is a play about a professor named Vivian Baring who has been diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer. And she faces her treatment with the same rigorous standards she's approached everything in her life. But she learns that you can't will cancer away, you can't reason with it. And it's about her struggling to reconcile her life and her death. And she's a very complicated character, which is one of the things I really like about this. She's not a nice person, and that's something that she's kind of struggling to reconcile. But she's always been very dedicated and hardworking. The personal connection that I had to this book the second time around was that when I picked it up, it just so happened that my mother had just finished treatment for advanced breast cancer. Her diagnosis was very severe. She was probably expected to die. Not probably. They expected her to. And it's surprising that she didn't. So, and I have a complicated relationship with my mother. So this book really spoke to me. I went through a roller coaster of emotions as I was reading it. And I still think about this play very often. It's really good. Next is Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is kind of hard to see in this light since it's a very white cover. But I've seen this described as a novel. I've seen this described as short stories. I've seen it described as interlocked stories. However you want to describe it, it's devastating. It is, of course, about the Vietnam War. It tells the stories of soldiers before they got to Vietnam, soldiers who are in Vietnam, and the things they see and experience while they're there, and soldiers back home after Vietnam, struggling to adjust back to the world after everything that they have been through. It's about the devastation of war, the heavy human cost of fighting, and the lasting impact of war on both society and the people who fight in it. I felt like I had PTSD as I was reading this book and after I've read this book. I've wanted to reread it for a long time, but I feel like I don't quite have the emotional stamina to do it. At some point I really want to get back to it, but I feel like I need to emotionally prepare myself because it really was disquieting. There are parts of it that were shocking, but not in a manipulative way or a lurid way. It's really showing the human side of it, and of course that is horrifying. So that's The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Now, in a curious bit of timing, I picked up Annie Proulx's book Close Range just as news began breaking that they were going to be adapting one of the short stories in here into a movie about gay cowboys. You see, what happened was I was working in a Borders at the time, so when Bad Dirt, Annie Proulx's collection of short stories, came out, I picked it up and I read it and I really liked it. And then somehow only after I finished it did I notice this part here that says Wyoming Stories 2. I hadn't known that it was a follow-up to a previous collection of short stories. So as soon as I finished this book, I picked up Close Range. And if you haven't guessed, the story in this collection that made me cry is Brokeback Mountain. This is the story sold on its own. I have that version of it, but this is how it appears when it's in the full collection with the rest of them. I really liked that short story well before I saw the movie, and I think the movie does a really great job expanding on the short story. Everything in it feels true to that story. It's just a really great, well-told story that is like a sucker punch to the gut. And I think part of why it was so meaningful to me at the time was that I was in my early 20s and starting to tiptoe around the idea of coming out myself. I was still in the closet at the time. So I think that personal connection has made the story always mean even more to me than it would have under other circumstances. And then there's another book that I read in my 5th grade class, so you have to kind of wonder what kind of sadistic teacher I had that year. It's Bridge to Terabithia by Katherine Paterson. And I actually was not sure I liked this book as I was reading it because I did not feel a connection to Jess, who is the main character. He is athletic and wants to be a really fast runner. And I thought the friend that he makes in the book, Leslie, I thought she was kind of weird. So I didn't think I liked this book, and then they become very deep friends. They create this world, Terabithia, in the woods, where they go, and it's all about their imaginations and their creativity. And of course, they have no idea that tragedy is looming in their future. So even though I didn't think I liked this book, I was devastated when I got to the ending and that tragic event happened. So I've always remembered this book, which means I probably liked it a lot more than I thought I did as I was reading it. And that's always a funny thing when that happens. And now we get into the books that I've already talked about on the channel. So I'm going to be a little bit brief with them. The first one is All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews, which has a great cover. I love it. And if you haven't seen any of my other videos, this is a kind of fictionalized version of Miriam Toews' actual relationship with her actual sister, who was a celebrated pianist who committed suicide. And that should probably tell you why this book is a tearjerker, but it's also funny. It's a really well-told book. It's about the bonds of sisterhood, the depth of familial love, and it's about how to help somebody who just does not want help. It's a great book. I recommend it all the time. So that's All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews. And then my favorite book from 2018, The Great Believers by Rebecca Mackay, which also has a really beautiful cover. This has 2 different narratives and goes back and forth between them. The first one is about Yale Tishman in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Chicago, where the AIDS epidemic was in full swing, and Yale is watching it spread among his friends. He loses friends. He's trying not to get ill himself. And the other story is a woman who is a friend of Yale's, but kind of on the perimeter of his story. And she moves to the focus of the other narrative, where she has arrived in near-present Paris looking for her now estranged daughter. It's a really beautiful, heartfelt story. Part of what I really like about it is that it talks about grief and tragedy and trauma and how they ripple into the future. And the effect doesn't really go away. And it also goes back a little bit to tell the story of World War I, and that just furthers the theme that trauma keeps rippling out into the present. It's a really well done book, very heartfelt. It does not at all feel manipulative or cloying to me. I recommend it. And then there's a book I actually just finished, which is The Gifts of the Body by Rebecca Brown. Rebecca Brown had worked as a home care worker to AIDS patients back in the day. This book was published in 1994. It is a collection of interlocked stories about a home care worker treating AIDS patients. And because Rebecca Brown had worked as a home care worker, it's very detailed, it's very smart. The things that it does and the way it's structured are very good, and it's very humane. It talks about life and death and compassion and how hard it can be to be a compassionate person when the world is such a brutal place. And one thing I also really liked about it is that it does not try to portray AIDS as a gay problem. It has a character who's a grandmother, a character who's a mother, and shows how everybody is impacted by it. So I definitely recommend that one. You may have to special order it. It's hard to find on bookshelves since it's so old, but it is still in print. I recommend that very much. I recommend all of these. There's really not a dud in the bunch. Another one of my favorite books recently was The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. This is the story of Cyril Avery, who is born in Ireland when it is a very repressed, very Catholic country. Cyril is gay. He grows up and comes of age, and then he comes out and finds his place in the world. And again, maybe it's my personal connection for my own coming out story, but I really felt impacted by this book. It just moved me. It is a proper chunky book, but it's well worth your time. It's very funny. Like all my puny sorrows, this is a book that made me cry and made me laugh out loud, which making me laugh out loud is even harder for a book to do than making me cry. I definitely recommend this book as well. It's very smartly done. And then there is The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, which I talked about in my favorite books of all time. Yes, this is a children's book. Yes, it is a book about a porcelain bunny. Yes, it made me cry. Yes, I was an adult when I read this, and I don't care. You can judge me all you want. It's a great book. And I think what really resonated with me is that it talks about the importance of being open and vulnerable, even though you've been hurt before, and even though the world is full of painful things and disappointments. It's just so good. This is also the book that I gift to people most often, most recently to my foster son at Christmas. It also has beautiful illustrations. It's really good. You can't go wrong with this book. And then another one of my favorite books from last year was There by Tommy Orange. Again, it's kind of confusing. It's kind of a novel, kind of a series of interlocked stories about modern Native people, and they are all on a collision course with a powwow that is going to be held in Oakland. Tommy Orange does a really smart job subverting traditional tropes about Native Americans in literature. It's really good. But he clues you into the fact that this powwow is going to be robbed and that's going to end in tragedy very early on, I think even in the first story. And so I thought I was prepared for it. I did not expect this book to make me cry, but I was devastated when I got to the end, just like fully heart-wrenching. So I think that speaks to the power of Tommy Orange in creating these characters. I liked them. I really felt for them. And when I got to the ending, I really cared about what happened to them. And for a debut novelist, that is really no small achievement. It's a powerful book. I definitely recommend this one if you have not done it. So there you go. There are 11 books that have made me cry. It's possible there are more that I just didn't remember before Goodreads happened. So what books have made you cry? I'd really like to know. Do you have any recommendations based on these books? Because I like all of these books. Or do you disagree with me? Do you think any of these are cloying and manipulative and you just can't stand them? Let's talk about that. I know a lot of people who were devastated by The Fault in Our Stars. I can't stand that book. So let's talk about it. I'll be back. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing or watching some more of my videos or leaving me a comment. And I'll be back again. Until then, happy reading.